Hello everyone, today we talk about the events of 238 AD in the war that broke out between Maximinus Thrax and the Italian nobility that had already backed the revolt of the Gordians in Africa, and that we will have to talk about this as there are different interpretations both on Maximinus Thrax and the reasons why the Gordians and the Roman estates, essentially, of Italy and Africa, where this was more intensely the local form of administration, rose up. Right? We never talk about any of these emperors, for that matter. So this video is just about the crucial events of this year, quite specifically, and seeing what was the balance of power, especially supporting Pupienus and Balbinus, that after the death of the Gordians had risen to power, as the Senate fundamentally had proposed them. But as we will see, also there was an additional dynastic continuity, backing, let's say, of the dynastic continuity with Gordian III, that was a son, if I'm not wrong, Gordian I. No, it was the grandson of Gordian I. This was the son of a daughter of Gordian I. And also other forces that include the plebs of Rome, even the gladiators, and the Praetorians as well, that all had different purposes in this time. Consider that since Septimius Severus, and this will play a role also in the defense of Italy against the army of Maximinus Thrax, it was the Legio Secunda Partica, that was settled in Albano, next close to Rome. And as you know, that since Sulla hadn't been possible because legions were not allowed in Italy, in fact the Praetorians were 9 cohorts, not to make the 10th one, it would make a legion. This was a bit the mechanism, but the emperors had changed, mitigated a bit. This is part of, if you want, of the 3rd century crisis already. Maximinus is a very fascinating figure because he's been interpreted in different ways. As I was saying before, some, like Altheim, suggested that he was even of Germanic, some Alan origin. Was not true. It was an invention of a later history. He was probably a Thracian. Let's say, you see, after the Constitution Antoniniana, formally all subjects of the empire had become Romans, but not quite completely from a legal point of view, because some had remained out, those who couldn't speak Latin, for example. So there is this indication about Maximinus being mixed with those people. And given his militaristic interest, also the resuming of the Aurelian strategic goals, that is the conquest of Germany, that he had also undertaken as an expedition that had squeezed, in fact, the Latifundia met with this important opposition. There is, in fact, a sort of prodrome of what would have become the series of the so-called Illyrian emperors of the 3rd century, that in a few decades would have, as you know, done pretty interesting things in this kind of disgregational moment in which the empire literally risked to be wiped out. And about the reasons of the rebellion, I think this one is sound. I mean, the idea that there were also some, Soviet historians who said it was a class struggle between the people and the latifundia, the large estates holders. This is not really true, because we find the mobilization of the same colonists next to the masters against the impositions of Maximinus officials and so on. And Gordians, misadventure, we could say, in Africa, also because they were killed, was because essentially the neighboring Numidia was loyal to Maximinus, and was the only Roman legion stationed in Africa there that was under the control of a governor that hated the Gordians' guts, and so he managed to destroy them. So the center of the video is Italy as such, as it had become. As you know, during the in this phase, gradually, the provinces had gained more importance than the Italian peninsula. But still, this is the year 238 is one of those moments where you really have essentially an Italic comeback, or an Italian, if you prefer, because Italy administratively was here comprehending historically already the Cisalpine Gaul, etc. So we can talk about Italian altogether, as we say, for differentiating the Italic peoples from the Italian peoples as those who lived, broadly speaking, in the Italian peninsula. And that was a political and social system, still fundamentally in charge, but as we will see, especially from the power base, as we will see now, also quite changed from, with some already kind of almost dominatus features in the Roman oligarchy, especially. Naturally, Rome here is central, but there were lots of other cities that had maintained in Italy the Municipia had maintained a great importance and prestige. There was a conflict between the cities and the large estates owners for reasons that now we can't digress on, and we'll see some other time. But exactly because they were, at the end of the day, sharing the same, what Maximinus was bringing on with its militaristic base, with these army also composed by, since he had come back from Germany, he was full of Germans, by the way. There were the Maurian cavalrymen, the Osroenian archers, all elements that the Italian nobility perceived as, of course, as barbaric, and this provincial ruler that also had this kind of shady background that wanted to impose himself against the senatorial system seemed unacceptable, and managed to win, right, as we will see now at the siege of Aquileia, that as a municipium was one of the most emblematic, in that case, of the northern Italian Roman municipal culture and identity. And in fact, the most interesting aspect is this continuity of the old Italy, because all Italy backed the senatorial rebellion against Maximinus. This was really a clash at that point, because Africa was out of the game, right? Italy was, of course, kind of larger, and here it was just standing, basically, not just against Maximinus, but essentially against all the other provinces, right? Because this was not a struggle much over the issue per se, or this specific emperor, but it was also showing the other provinces that Italy still had it, right? This still was the center of the empire, and this is a hardcore concept that was felt at the time. Like we know from the sources, we'll make also some example now, because it was a matter of whom had the imperium, right? And you know that this was shared. I mean, the emperor was the medium with the divinity, but in this sense, whoever could oppose standing against them could earn the imperium itself. We will see some interesting also mythological reference, especially in Aquileia with Balbinus, the Celtic deity. So much we can measure it, right? We can measure the Italian commitment because the levy in the country was successful, right? Consider we're in the 3rd century, so we think this fact towards the late Roman Empire, this in general the system was about the disarmament of the middle classes, the idea that Italic legionnaire that had his own farm and went to fight on out there still remained, even in the early imperial system, as also properly a class of people that had gentrified. Maybe they weren't soldiers anymore, but still had made it, right, and had that robust capacity to also resist the senatorial luxus was crumbling, that everybody was becoming a servant, etc. Instead, here there was this was true, like it was happening, right? The latifundia were expanding. In general, in the Roman system, the luxus had won, right? And the dynastic profile of the empire had gotten that direction, right? In a sense, Maximinus wanted to break that, wanted to employ those resources, and Italy was reactionary to this. So it's not even a positive thing per se, right? Because at the end of the day, this is what also in early imperial times the emperors had fought for, right? That is maintaining, again, a sort of, especially through the equestrians, albeit their aims were the same of the nobility, but still being the lower class to counterbalance the senatorial power. They also had their own provinces, etc. Italy was naturally very prestigious in this regard. It still had within the cities properly the bulk of that, again, that municipality, that gentry that would also maintain historically that sense of, of earned autonomy, right? I made a video last spring or winter that was about the Augustan order worth dying through Roman, right? That was the base of all this idea that here was a passage from citizens to subjects, right, with the Constitution Antoniniana, normally Caracalla's edict, but still there was never like a formalization of this concept, right? Somebody was traditionally free and as such noble and as such could bear arms, right? So it was an interesting struggle. The peninsula was the old center of the empire, and it had somewhat maintained also mentally this, and also in a kind of a realistic sense of not wanting to accept it. The fact that the province, this superiority, essentially forget or not wanting to see that the provinces, especially from Severian times onwards, had assumed an ever greater importance, right? Italians didn't care. They said, we are the empire. We have made the empire. It's ours, right? So still at this time, this thing would dilute over time naturally because also resources run short. The same idea why the West evaporated, whereas the East remained intact. But on a different model, of course, there was this dynastic, but it was more kind of monarchically reaffirmed directly from scratch with Constantine, etc. And it's less than, it's just a bit more than half a century later, right? So consider this even compare it to our century count in the last one. Didn't last that much, right? So at this point, Italy resumed awarely, self-consciously, its place of nation guide, let's say, of the Roman Empire. And the motto was properly the fact that to the Senate and to the people of Rome, and in particular to Italy in this sense, because the equation was made a bit like that, given that the provinces had been gradually Romanized, so made what the Romans were essentially in Italy like, even just also through colonization, through the same Italians, etc. And, they thought it in a kind of a national sense as well. We don't have to forget this about the Roman Empire. That still, it was the empire of the Romans. Otherwise, it would have been something else. Even the fact we talk so much about the Middle Ages, why did even the Germans took on the name of Romans, literally, in their identity, right? By the 13th century, that was the idea, because the ethnic prestige attached to Romanity was the one of a stock. And this was present in all Indo-European religions. So that the Roman one had sublimated it, especially with world conquest. So it was an enormous deal. Nobody had infringed the system before, so it had been so clamorous that Rome had taken over the world that it seemed impossible, right? That now, what Maximinus Thrax, right? Who the hell is even this guy to force our own system, our own prerogatives, or what we earned, right? So this is the quote: by tradition to the Senate and people of Rome was owed, so anote, that means properly wanted by God. This is a term that is found in Greek, because these are also, of course, a lot of Greek sources, properly the expression in the Gospels, from the above, from a higher place of things which come from heaven or God, from the beginning, from the very first, right? This is crucial. The idea of the first ancestor, too, and the idea of the first as the best, right? The empire, right, by tradition, to the Senate of people of Rome, was owed the imperium. And through this motto, propagandistically, the provinces had been called to accept the appointment of the two Gordians, Gordian I, Gordian II. And now that the two Gordians had died, this motto served to organize resistance against Maximinus, right? So that's why this is an important struggle, because it was really the foundational ideology of the empire to be shattered. And it's really meaningful because you see, we're normally brought to think of the, say, the end of the empire is the moment in which the ideology was shattered. No, at that point it had been consolidated. Still, at the beginning of the 3rd century, after all, still an early time, was instead a moment in which something else was being aggressed, still at the root core, because after all, Roman domination was still something relatively recent, right? So we can't just read the 3rd century as, it was the beginning of what eventually happened later, because the premises were really different, right? And on the contrary, the 3rd century crisis was perfectly surpassed by the empire, right? With important internal shifts, right? This is not to say that, in fact, think about the rising importance of the provinces of outer cities compared to Rome, but not the Romanity of the empire. This was a big deal, right? So, in order to bring, however, these forces together, there needed to be a head. The Gordians had been killed. Maximinus, in theory, was the emperor, so now this rebellion needed a new leader. And you see, the Senate had come up with a correction of the constitutional formula, right? With the idea of exploiting this crisis by bringing back the Senate at the center rather than the emperor. But the Roman plebs was tied by this point historically to a dynastic ideal, right? It didn't intend anymore the senatorial wish for libertas of a certain republican type, right? For which, to the 2 collegial emperors who were elected, these Pupienus and Balbinus, interesting because it, kind of echoes the dual, collegial role of the consuls, etc., was necessary to add as Caesar the young Gordian III that was, as we were saying before, born by a daughter of Gordian I. So there was a dynastic continuity that the Roman plebs wanted, because the Roman plebs literally revolted when the Pupienus and Balbinus were making their imperial defile in Rome. The mob got angry because it said, no, these are emperors. We want the monarch. And this is interesting because it shows how, after all, the emperor had still remained, in spite of the general loss in individual freedom in the empire, of personal freedom, on average, the guarantee, let's say, of the protector of the lower classes, right, against the senatorial aristocracy. And this, again, especially in a urban sense, so this is not to think just the mob of Rome, but the mob of Rome was representative of the city, and the hell of a city that Rome was, as not just the capital of the empire, but a huge one, etc. But this other municipia, etc., had normally contended with the senatorial order, the control over the countryside. So it was very important for say, the Senate tried, right, to come unchecked in power, but the system said no, right? And consider here, there's not another ruler, right? The Senate is there, still an important reality, in spite of the depletion of its own importance, at the advantage of the emperors. But still, right, the rest of the system can fight if you want the high nobility, the real high aristocracy. And because they and this correction of the senatorial constitutional formula seems like, okay, well, they attached this kid that was practically, I think Gordian III was the youngest Roman emperor ever that actually came to power. So we say, what about that, right? Also, the Gordians had been crushed in Africa. There was, but in reality, it's really important because it indicates the tenacious call to the dynastic legitimism. The mob wanted a dynasty ruling Rome and the Empire, right? So there's a remarkable distance between the traditionalism of the Roman plebs, with its dynastic ideals that, after all, had been anti-republican. You see how, actual, if you want, this system is. And instead, the senatorial traditionalism that was based on the ideal of the emperor as Optimus and collegial at the same time. That is to say, the princeps in theory is just, in fact, the primus inter pares. He works with the Senate because he is part of that, fundamentally, not above it, not out of it, right? He has a higher status, but it doesn't belong to this world in a way. And that's why, but he's still in the Senate as a man. This is really important to realize. And issues didn't stop here, however, because it was not enough even to have Gordian III on the throne. Because next to the Senate and the plebs, in Rome, there was another essential element for the life of the state. That is to say, the aforementioned Praetorians, right? The ones that, having remained in Rome, because the emperor normally they followed, right, didn't find themselves, in fact, with Maximinus for the expedition against the Germans, right? And in this moment of institutional instability, there were actually serious clashes in Rome between the Praetorians that were suspected at least to be loyal to Maximinus, and the plebs that was, instrumentalized, was used by the Senate and supported also by the gladiators, right? And there was, however, an agreement at that point, probably also because the Praetorians saw that there wasn't not really much they could do. Also, the entire country was mobilizing. It's not that they just sided with the emperor out of pure loyalty, as you know. They thought they could win something out of that as being the antagonists, but they saw probably the situation was not just favorable, and so there was this brief pacification between the Praetorians and the Senatus Populusque in Rome, and a pacification was quite quick, right? In spite of this bloodshed at the beginning, they probably tested each other's strength in the streets, right? And naturally, it was only apparent, but it's still relevant for the events that will follow, and that will, in fact, fill with very high meaning the complex event of that year 238. And in order to control the Praetorian forces, the Senate, as it happened at some point already, proposed to them a senator that related to Pupienus, that is perhaps a patruelis of Pupienus, that would be a cousin, fundamentally, in the same way in which, since Augustan times, the principle that the senatorial order had to provide, for example, the urban prefect, had managed to be imposed, right? This had never, institutionally, they came out of customs that gradually became, traditional, and, a sort of political point of reference, right? It was this urban prefect that was essentially the closest office to the emperor, right? It was of enormous importance. And this connection with the senatorial aspect and the Praetorians is also fascinating, because it does show how the two traditionally different forces had somewhat managed to stick together at this point, when unity was necessary in any case, because the Praetorians risked to be taken out. And as we will see, they weren't just the only force that existed in Italy at that point. and the country altogether was against Maximinus, and Rome itself, so the cohorts alone, also against the mob, the gladiators, had to be quite wary. And Maximinus at this point was in Sirmium, in Sremca Mitrovica, if I'm not wrong, today's Serbia, where, that, as you know, Sirmium would become one of those capitals of the empire that will supplant gradually Rome, albeit together with others fundamentally, in this multi-provincial asset. And he left suddenly, right, for Italy to suppress the rebellion. But as you know, this concluded itself in a failure, right? To the emperor, that was a veteran from victorious expeditions against the Germans, supported by the Illyrian troops and by the rest of his strong army, as we've seen, there were the Mauryan horsemen, the Osranian archers, and this many new recruits drawn from the defeated Germans. The Italian population opposed especially its tenacious traditionalism and its own unstoppable hostility, right? And with this force, it was especially a moral force, it reached victory. A city sustained specifically the siege of Maximinus at the gates of northern Italy, Aquileia. Aquileia was the center of the gentry and of the economical well-being of northern Italy. And now the necessity of resupplying, the impossibility of carrying out requisitions of goods in such a hostile territory made it difficult for Maximinus to carry on the siege of the city. It was also a pretty well defended one. The peasants had taken away everywhere. Nothing could be found in the countryside around. It made scorched earth strategy, and Maximinus' army, from a besieger that he was, it transformed itself almost in a besieged army. Right, the tenacious blockade and the lack of reinforcements weakened it, obliged to, expose itself to enemy harassment, to deplete forces in the perimeter. And what is interesting is probably the moral clash here, because the Italian resistance was unexpected, right? The troops were just like, say, we'll simply march in, there is no consistent force that can't stop us, because we are the best, we are the veterans, we have all these troops from everywhere, the Imperium is from our side. They stop, they get bogged down at the first obstacle. Draw some parallelism here. Every reference is completely random, but this is the point. The morale sank to the point that, with a very revealing mentality of the spiritual and religious life of that time, there was the spread of a legend of division of the protecting god of Aquileia, Balbinus. Right? It was a Celtic god. The Romans made of it a sort of Apollo, mostly because of his healing powers. Fighting an Airi, from the Greek sources, that is in the sky, for the defense of the city. This aspect is considered even in later times. I mean, the idea that every city has its patron saint, right? It was the same thing in the ancient world with the pagan deities as well. And the saints, as you know, have also sometimes a lot of anthropological continuity with these figures. And at a certain point, the soldiers of the second legion, the Parthia legion, that had women and children in Albano, as we've seen, and that quite and already soon had been impregnated of the Italian with the Italian traditionalism. I would probably say a Roman traditionalism, especially. Were the Albanenses, for this reason, killed Maximinus, and together with him his son that he had named Caesar. It's quite revealing. Now, Maximinus is an interesting figure also because, for example, his wife was very philosenatorial, and she was praised eventually in Rome for having tried to convince him to be mild or all these things. And naturally, Maximinus went down history with negative stigma, etc. But again, let's reflect on the context here and his background. Again, as I was saying before, maybe one day we will see him better, but it's a revealing and ferocious logic, as you understand here, about the power strength in the situation. So after a while, Maximinus having died, there was really not much the army besieging Aquileia could do. And gradually, Maximinus' troops essentially reconciled themselves with the Aquileians, and in general with the Italian population. And in fact, just outside Aquileia's walls, finally, the army that was already, hungry for the blockade that had been put around him in turn, and for the hostility of both citizens and peasants, even here reflect on the continuity we've seen in communal history between citizens and countryside, right? Especially in these areas, could acquire food, first of all, and any other product. Of course, armies were normally accompanied, but it's subtler trained by merchants, because the spoils were normally sold in the same place. I mean, not always, but not entirely. Some were brought in triumph, etc. But it was the merchants mostly. The Roman army had a hell of logistics, but it still worked with this other subcontractors fundamentally for the logistics, for the supplies and so on, that also took care of the loot, etc. And Aquileia, being quite rich, naturally could provide this stuff quite quickly to the hungry. And so there is also ideologically a great meaning behind this, that is to say, the Roman army having come back as the servant and not as the lord of the empire, as Maximinus also pre-occurring times, with especially the Illyrian emperors, seem to have, as properly the casus belli, essentially taking over in function of the Germanic expedition, the Imperial latifundia for the army, right? Instead, this came back to be tamed and subordinated to the center of power. And in Aquileia, in a way as to express to the inhabitants the gratitude of the country, came Emperor Pupienus. And from there, having disbanded in great part the Italian soldiers that had been recruited for the war against Maximinus, he came back to Rome. And some soldiers of trust, that at this point had become quite a characteristic trait, were Germans. This dates back to a long time, Augustus, and even before in part. And this also shows a degree of continuity with some practices before that. Now, also, we will make another video explaining the transformation of the Roman army at the time of Gordian III, especially, to see. I made a video about the Summa Cari, for example, that still it's mostly about Caracalla's times, but we are close and seeing how important these external records had become for the army itself. Just look at for the one of Maximinus himself. But since this had happened with some consistency still, and as we've seen, Pupienus and Balbinus had compromised their power with the Praetorians, the latter began to express their disappointment, let's put it in this way, and the same one essentially that had already manifested itself in the clash between the Praetorians and the Senatus Populusque in Rome. So this disappointed ended up in the assassination of Pupienus, and with him of Balbinus. In spite of the fact that among these two collegial emperors, let's put it in this way, there wasn't any more true relation of, strong and unanimous friendship. So the Caesar Gordian III was finally claimed as Augustus, and his election can be considered as a compromise in turn between the traditionalism of the senatorial body and the actual unsatisfaction of the Praetorian troops, right? Because the latter basically took out the same elements that had to compromise with and this entailed, like the Praetorian presence entailed still this direct connection with the emperor himself, and not with the senators that now, as we've seen, had even imposed themselves over they had essentially controlled the senatorial order at this point. So there was essentially a re-establishment, especially with the defeat of Maximinus' army and his death, the new center that had showed in this context where the more solid power of the empire still lay. So, as we will see perhaps better in another video, also Gordian III's reign marked further moment of great authority of the Praetorian cohorts and of the Praetorian prefecture. And this again, that political institutional mechanism that we will see when talking specifically about Gordian's reign. For today, however, I just stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.